Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Glasgow dynamite conspiracy of 1883. Imagine a city draped in the heavy, soot-stained velvet of a Victorian winter night. It is Saturday, the 20th of January. The air in Glasgow is thick with the har, that creeping maritime fog that rolls off the River Clyde, tasting of salt, wet stone, and the omnipresent tang of coal smoke. It is a silence that feels physical, pressing against the windowpanes of tenement flats and clinging to the iron railings of the docks. The gas lamps struggle against the gloom, casting long, wavering amber fingers across the cobblestones, but the mist swallows the light before it can reach the center of the street. In this stillness, the city breathes slowly, unaware that beneath the rhythmic pulse of the heavy industry, a fuse is already burning. We begin our journey on the south side of the river at the Tradeston Gasworks on Lillibank Street. It is roughly 10 o'clock in the evening. The works have been quiet for hours, the heavy labor of the day shift having ended at 6. Now, only a solitary watchman moves through the labyrinth of pipes and iron. The gasworks are a cathedral of industry, dominated by the massive, looming shapes of the gasometers. These giant iron skeletons, filled with the very breath of the city's light, rise and fall within their guide frames. On this night, the metal is slick with condensation, and the faint, rhythmic clinking of chains against steel is the only music. The smell of raw coal gas is heavy here, sweet, pungent, and oily. It settles in the lungs, a reminder of the volatile power stored within these silent, dark tanks. The watchman's boots make a dull thud on the damp earth as he passes, his lantern a tiny, flickering star in a sea of iron shadows. Suddenly, the silence of Tradeston is not merely broken, it is obliterated. Two massive explosions tear through the night air, one following the other with a concussive force that feels like the earth itself has cracked open. At the gasworks, the iron side of a great gasometer is buckled inward, as if struck by the fist of a giant. The metal groans and shrieks, a terrifying sound of rending steel that echoes off the surrounding brick warehouses. Then comes the light. A pillar of fire erupts, turning the gray mist into a terrifying, incandescent orange. The heat is immediate, radiating outward and drying the damp cobblestones in a matter of seconds. Flames lick upward, reaching for the low-hanging clouds, turning the night into an artificial, hellish noon. Nearby, a carpet-beating works and a ropery are caught in the spreading heat, the smell of burning wool and hemp mixing with the sulphurous stench of the blast. While the echoes of the Tradeston blast are still vibrating in the bones of the city, we move north, crossing the river toward the heart of Glasgow's transport network. At the Buchanan Street Bridge, the scene is deceptively tranquil. The Forth and Clyde Canal lies flat and black, like a ribbon of polished obsidian. The water is perfectly still, reflecting the dim glow of the station lamps nearby. This bridge is a vital artery, a heavy stone structure that carries the weight of the city's ambition over the canal. But as the clock nears the same hour, the peace is shattered once more. A third device, hidden in the shadows of the masonry, detonates. The sound is different here, sharper, a cracking boom that sends a spray of stone and water high into the freezing air. The vibration travels through the frozen ground, rattling the windows of the railway station and sending a shiver through the passengers waiting on the platforms. The chaos is coordinated, a synchronized assault intended to plunge Glasgow into darkness and terror. At the bridge on Postle Road, a group of young people, including a soldier named Adam Barr, are walking home through the fog. They notice a strange metal box resting on the stone parapet. In the dim light, curiosity overcomes caution. Adam reaches out, his fingers brushing the cold, damp metal. He thinks perhaps it is sand inside, or some forgotten tool. As his hand moves, the air is replaced by a blinding flash. The explosion at Postle Road is smaller than the one at the gasworks, but it is intimate and devastating. Adam is thrown back, his world dissolving into smoke and the ringing of his own ears. He survived, but the city would not soon forget the sight of the blood on the bridge, or the way the water of the canal surged against the damaged stone, threatening to flood the streets below. As the smoke begins to mingle with the persistent Glasgow fog, the magnitude of the night starts to set in. 11 people lie injured across the city. The primary targets, the gasworks, the bridges, the railway, reveal a calculated attempt to sever the city's lifelines. The authorities, led by the local police and later joined by government experts like Colonel Magendie, begin to sift through the debris. They find the evidence of lignin dynamite, a powerful explosive that speaks of a professional hand. The city is gripped by a cold, waking nightmare. Who were these shadows in the mist? Names like John Cochrane, William Jordan, and Mary Gemmell will soon emerge from the darkness. But for now, there is only the sound of distant sirens, the crackle of dying fires, and the heavy, uncertain silence of a city under siege. Sleep now and let the fog protect you, as we prepare to follow the trail of those who sought to burn the night. The story continues as the mist begins to clear. The air over the Tradeston gasworks hung heavy. A thick, suffocating tapestry of coal gas and pulverized brick that seemed to cling to the skin like a damp wool blanket. In the hours following the twin blasts on that cold Saturday of January 20th, 1883, the silence was almost more terrifying than the noise had been. It was a dense, ringing quiet, broken only by the rhythmic drip of water from ruptured pipes and the distant, mournful whistle of a steam engine somewhere in the fog. The investigators moved through the wreckage with a slow, deliberate caution, their heavy leather boots crunching over a landscape that had, only moments before, been a monument to Glaswegian industry. Now it was a graveyard of iron and glass. They carried oil lanterns that cast long, flickering shadows against the skeletons of the shattered gasometers, the yellow light catching the shimmer of settling soot that fell through the air like a black, winter snow. As the first gray light of Sunday morning began to bleed through the persistent Scottish mist, the true nature of the night began to reveal itself among the ruins. At the Lillibank Street Works, the police were not merely looking for survivors. They were searching for the soul of the explosion. One officer, his fingers numb from the biting chill, reached into a pile of charred timber and pulled away a piece of mangled metal that did not belong to any known piece of gas-regulating machinery. It was a fragment of steel, jagged and sharp, but with a peculiar, intentional curve. It felt heavier than it looked, cold and unforgiving in his palm. Nearby, the smell of burnt gunpowder and sulfur remained stubborn, refusing to be washed away by the drizzling rain. This was the first physical evidence of what the newspapers would soon call an infernal machine. It was a realization that chilled the investigators far more than the January wind. This was not a catastrophic failure of engineering or a simple accident of pressure. This was a calculated, mechanical malice. The search expanded outward, tracing the path of the coordinated terror. At Buchanan Street Station, the scene was equally harrowing. The explosion there had ripped through the very heart of the city's transit, leaving the freight house a hollowed-out shell of splintered wood and twisted rails. Here, the investigators found more than just metal. They found the personal artifacts of a night interrupted. A dropped cap, a shattered pocket watch, and the dark, glistening stains of blood where the injured had been pulled from the rubble. Among those caught in the chaos were names that would soon be whispered in every tenement and parlor in Glasgow. John Cochrane, Mary Gemmell, and William Jordan had been going about their ordinary lives, perhaps thinking of a warm hearth or a late supper, when the world simply tore apart beneath them. Sifting through the debris where they had fallen, the police recovered more curious remnants. Small, delicate brass cogs and bits of spring steel were found embedded in the woodwork, looking for all the world like the internal organs of a clock that had been taught to kill. At the bridge over the Forth and Clyde Canal at Postle Road, the investigators found a different kind of wreckage. The stone and iron of the viaduct had held firm against the blast, but the evidence left behind was perhaps the most damning of all. Because the device had not fully achieved its destructive potential, the remnants were more intact. They found the scorched remains of a fuse and the unmistakable residue of dynamite, a substance that was still relatively new and terrifying to the public imagination. The experts, led by the renowned Colonel Magendie, arrived from London with their magnifying glasses and their meticulous notes. They knelt in the dirt, ignoring the dampness seeping into their trousers, to examine the way the metal had been sheared. They spoke in low, urgent tones about the precision of the clockwork and the quality of the explosives. These were not the crude pipe bombs of an amateur. These were sophisticated tools of war, designed with a terrifying degree of synchronization to strike at the city's very veins. Its fuel, its transport, and its waterways. By the time the bells of the city's cathedrals were ringing for the morning service, a dark narrative was being woven together from these fragments of steel and clockwork. The sheer distance between the three targets, Tradeston in the south, Buchanan Street in the center, and Postle Road in the north, precluded any chance of a singular accident. The timing was too perfect, the methods too identical. The investigators began to connect the dots, tracing a line back to the shadowy whispers they had heard in the back rooms of public houses along the Salt Market. The name of the Fenian movement, and more specifically the Ribbon Society, began to surface like a ghost in the fog. It was a name that carried the weight of centuries of political fire and blood, now manifesting in the modern age through the cold, calculated hum of a timer. Every twisted screw and every shard of iron pulled from the gasworks was a piece of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that pointed toward a secret army hiding in plain sight within the city's bustling immigrant communities. The investigation became a race against a phantom. The police knew that the men who had planted these machines were likely still in the city, perhaps even watching from the edges of the crowd as the debris was cleared away. There was a frantic energy to the search now, a desperate need to find the workshop where these infernal devices had been birthed. They looked for the smell of acid on a man's clothes, the stain of chemicals on his fingertips, or the telltale presence of fine metal shavings in his pockets. Every person who had been seen near the canal or the gasworks on that Saturday night was a suspect. The fear in Glasgow was no longer just about the fire or the darkness. It was about the invisible presence of the next machine, ticking away somewhere in the shadows, waiting for its moment to turn more steel into fragments and more lives into memories. The city held its breath, listening to the heartbeat of its own machinery, wondering which sound was the rhythm of progress and which was the countdown to another night of smoke and glass. The fog in Glasgow during the early weeks of 1883 was not merely a weather pattern. It was a heavy, soot-stained shroud that clung to the soot-blackened stones of the Salt Market. In the narrow, winding winds where the light of the flickering gas lamps struggled to penetrate the gloom, the city felt compressed, its secrets held tight within the damp embrace of the river silt and coal smoke. It was here, in the shadow of the great industrial machine, that the Ribbon Society operated. They were a clandestine cell of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, an invisible thread woven into the fabric of the working class. Their presence was felt more than seen, a low hum of dissent that vibrated through the floorboards of the local pubs. The local police beat officers knew that something was stirring. They observed the groups of men gathering with unfailing regularity on the first Monday of every month. Yet the true nature of their business remained a phantom, a whisper in a city that had grown accustomed to the roar of the shipyards and the hiss of the steam engines. This was the Silent Network, a group of men and women bound by an oath that superseded the laws of the crown, moving through the gray streets like shadows cast by a dying fire. At the heart of this web were John Cochrane and William Jordan. Cochrane was a man of intense, quiet focus, his hands calloused by labor but steady with the precision of a clockmaker. He moved through the crowded tenements with a deliberate slowness, his eyes always scanning the horizon for a tale that never seemed to come. Beside him stood William Jordan, a man whose resolve was as cold and unyielding as the iron bridges that spanned the Clyde. They were not the flamboyant rebels of a bygone era. They were the architects of a new kind of warfare, one built on the volatile power of chemistry and the anonymity of the urban crowd. In the back room of Lennox's public house, the air would grow thick with the smell of stale ale and cheap tobacco as they pored over maps and diagrams. The wood of the table was stained with the rings of many glasses, but the papers they spread across it were crisp and lethal. They spoke in low, rhythmic tones, their voices barely rising above the distant clatter of carriage wheels on the cobblestones. Every word was a gamble, every glance a silent pact. They were waiting for the right moment, a night when the darkness would be their greatest ally, and the city would finally hear the message they had been preparing in the silence of their hearts. While Cochrane and Jordan provided the will, it was Mary Gemmell who provided the means, operating within the logistical shadows that the authorities so often overlooked. Mary was a woman of sharp features and even sharper instincts, a shopkeeper whose modest storefront served as a vital node in the conspiracy's supply chain. To the casual observer, her shop was a place of mundane utility, smelling of salted butter, dry flour, and the sharp tang of vinegar. But beneath the floorboards, tucked behind crates of root vegetables and sacks of grain, lay the components of destruction. She was the one who managed the arrival of the goods, moving the heavy glass carboys of nitric and sulfuric acid with a practiced ease that belied their terrifying potential. Her hands, often stained with the ink of ledgers or the dust of the pantry, were the same hands that carefully partitioned the chemicals that Timothy Featherstone had sourced from across the country. She moved through the shop with a rhythmic grace, the rustle of her heavy skirts a constant, comforting sound that masked the clinking of glassware in the cellar. In the hierarchy of the silent network, she was the steady pulse, the person who ensured that when the time came, the fire would have its fuel. She understood better than most that the greatest secrets are often hidden in plain sight, buried under the weight of the everyday. The preparation of the devices was a sensory experience that left an indelible mark on those involved. In the cramped, poorly ventilated spaces where the nitroglycerin was handled, the air became thick and sweet, a cloying scent that sat heavy on the tongue and made the head throb with a dull, persistent ache. Cochrane and Jordan worked with a tactile reverence for the material. They felt the cold, oily texture of the dynamite, its weight surprising in the hand, like a leaden loaf of bread. They handled the metal boxes, the machines, with fingertips that had grown sensitive to every burr and scratch on the iron casings. There was a profound silence in these moments, a quiet so deep that the scratching of a mouse behind the wainscoting sounded like a thunderclap. They were crafting a disaster out of silence and steel, weaving together the volatile strands of their ideology with the cold reality of industrial explosives. The flickering candlelight cast long, distorted shadows against the damp walls, making it seem as though the very room was inhabited by the ghosts of their intentions. Every movement had to be slow, every breath measured, for they were walking a tightrope between a successful strike and a premature ending that would leave nothing but a crater in the Glasgow mud. As January 20, 1883, approached, the tension within the silent network became a physical weight. It was a pressure that felt like the deepening of a winter freeze, cracking the skin and chilling the marrow. The conspirators moved through the city with a heightened awareness, their senses tuned to the rhythm of the streets. They noticed the way the wind whistled through the girders of the Postle Bridge and the specific, metallic echo of the trains pulling into Buchanan Street Station. These were no longer just landmarks. They were targets, mapped out in their minds with surgical precision. Mary Gemmell watched from her doorway as the men passed by, a silent nod the only acknowledgement of the storm that was about to break. The city of Glasgow went about its business, the thousands of workers unaware that the very infrastructure that supported their lives, the gas that lit their homes, the canals that carried their goods, was being scrutinized by eyes that saw only the potential for fire. The network remained silent, the trap was set, and the countdown had begun in the quiet corners of the salt market, where the fog was the thickest and the shadows were the deepest. The air was charged with a static anticipation, a breath held in the lungs of the city, waiting for the first spark to turn the silence into a roar that would be heard across the empire. The fog in Glasgow during those late January days of 1883 was not merely a weather pattern. It was a living, breathing shroud. It clung to the soot-stained sandstone of the tenements, turning the gaslights into blurry, amber orbs that struggled to pierce the gloom. Beneath this veil, the surveillance was invisible yet omnipresent. Detectives from the local force, their collars turned up against the biting damp, blended into the shadows of narrow winds and damp alleyways. They watched the flickering windows of the lodging houses with the patience of predators. Every footfall on the slick, uneven cobblestones seemed to echo with a heavy, metallic significance. The air tasted of coal smoke and salt, a thick, heavy mixture that sat in the lungs of those waiting in the dark. For days, the authorities had been weaving a net, a quiet perimeter that grew tighter with every passing hour. They observed the figures moving in and out of the shadows. Men like John Cochrane and William Jordan, who walked with a forced casualness that betrayed their internal franticness. There was a specific tension in the way they moved, a quickening of the pulse that the watchers could almost sense through the brick and mortar. The circle was no longer just a concept. It was a physical reality of men in heavy wool coats standing at every corner, their eyes never leaving the doors of those suspected of holding the keys to destruction. The focus of this silent hunt eventually settled on the modest, unassuming dwellings where the conspirators sought refuge. When the moment finally arrived to break the silence, the transition from surveillance to action was jarring. The officers moved with a sudden, disciplined urgency toward the lodgings. Inside the cramped rooms of Maitland Street, the atmosphere was thick with more than just the smell of poverty and unwashed laundry. As the heavy wooden doors were forced open, the detectives were met with a pungent, chemical sharpness that burned the back of the throat, a scent that had no place in a domestic setting. The rooms were small, cluttered with the mundane detritus of life, yet hidden within were the components of a nightmare. They found Mary Gemmell there, her presence a quiet but vital link in the chain of events. The floorboards groaned under the weight of the searchers as they peeled back the layers of deception. In the dim light of a flickering candle, the textures of the room became ominous. The rough grain of the wooden tables, the stained wallpaper peeling away in long, dry strips, and the cold, damp stone of the hearth all seemed to hold secrets that were finally being dragged into the light of day. In the corners of the room, tucked away in cupboards and beneath sagging bed frames, lay the physical manifestation of their intent. The investigators discovered jars of thick, oily liquids that shimmered with a sickly, yellowish hue in the lantern light. This was the nitroglycerine, a substance so volatile that the very air in the room felt unstable, as if a loud noise might shatter the world. There were glass carboys filled with sulfuric and nitric acids, their stoppers crusted with white, crystalline residue. The detectives handled these items with a terrifyingly delicate touch, their fingers trembling slightly as they felt the cold glass. They found lengths of fuse, coiled like sleeping snakes, and heavy iron pipes designed to contain the fury of the blast. These were the so-called infernal machines, half-constructed and waiting for the final spark. The sheer volume of material was staggering, enough to level a city block. Each item was meticulously documented, the scratch of the lead pencil on paper the only sound in the room besides the heavy breathing of the men who realized just how close they had come to disaster. The metallic clink of tools and the soft splash of chemicals being secured created a haunting rhythm, a soundtrack to the dismantling of a plot that had been intended to shake the foundations of the British Empire. Beyond the volatile liquids and the iron casings, the most damning evidence was perhaps the most fragile. Stashed within a tattered leather valise and hidden inside the lining of a coat were sheaves of paper that provided the intellectual blueprint for the violence. These letters and documents were the bridge between the small rooms in Glasgow and the wider, more dangerous world of international conspiracy. The detectives smoothed out the crumpled pages, the paper feeling thin and brittle beneath their calloused thumbs. The ink was dark and assertive, the handwriting often hurried as if the authors were writing against the clock. These were communications from across the Atlantic, letters that spoke of funding, of timing, and of the ideological fire that fueled the Fenian cause. They contained names that were whispered in secret meetings and instructions that mapped out the intended targets, the gasworks, the bridges, the very arteries of the city. As the officers read through the correspondence, the scale of the trapped circle became clear. It wasn't just these 3 individuals caught in the room. It was a network of radicalism that stretched thousands of miles. The letters were a map of intent, a trail of breadcrumbs that led directly to the hearts of John Cochrane and William Jordan. Each word was a nail in the coffin of their defense, a silent testimony to a plan that had been nurtured in the shadows of 2 continents. As the night bled into the early hours of the morning, the apprehension was finalized. The suspects were led out into the cold Glasgow air, their faces pale and set in expressions of defiant silence. The iron handcuffs felt freezing against their wrists, the metal biting into the skin with a final, locking click. The transition from the warm, chemical-laden air of the apartment to the sharp, winter wind was a physical shock. Mary Gemmell walked between the officers, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the ground as they passed the very gaslights the police had used to hide their watch. There was no grand struggle, no dramatic exchange of gunfire. There was only the heavy, rhythmic tread of boots on stone as the group moved toward the police van. The neighborhood remained mostly asleep, unaware that the very ground they lived upon had been saved from a subterranean fire. The silence of the streets was absolute, broken only by the distant whistle of a steam engine or the occasional bark of a stray dog. The circle had closed completely, leaving no room for escape. The suspects were now part of the machinery of the law, transported through the dark city to the cold, sterile cells of the Central Police Office, where the weight of the evidence they had left behind would begin to settle over them like the very fog that had once protected their movements. The details of the raid spread through the department like a slow-burning fuse. Every scrap of paper, every drop of acid, and every word of the recovered letters was catalogued with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. The authorities knew that they didn't just have a few bombers. They had the physical proof of a coordinated campaign. In the quiet of the evidence room, the letters were laid out on long tables, their edges curling in the dry air. They told a story of desperate men and a woman caught in the middle, all bound by a singular, violent purpose. The chemical jars were placed in reinforced boxes, their volatile contents now neutralized by the safety of the law. The detectives, finally able to rest, felt the exhaustion of the long surveillance seep into their bones. They had watched the circle tighten, seen the trap spring, and felt the immense relief of a disaster averted. But as they looked at the names on the letters and the sheer power of the explosives, they realized that while this circle had closed, the wider storm was still gathering. For now, however, the streets of Glasgow were quiet. The suspects sat in their cells, the silence of the prison a stark contrast to the roar they had intended to unleash. The meticulous work of the watchers had paid off, and as the first light of dawn began to gray the horizon, the city remained standing, its secrets safely locked away behind iron bars and legal ink. The air inside the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh held a peculiar, heavy stillness that December morning in 1953. Outside, The cobblestones of Parliament Square were slick with a fine, freezing mist, the kind that clings to the wool of heavy coats and chills the marrow of the bone. Inside, the world was a study in shadows and polished mahogany. The scent of damp fabric mingled with the ancient, dry smell of leather-bound law books and the faint, acrid trace of coal smoke drifting in from the chimneys of the Royal Mile. Every footstep on the stone floor echoed with a sharp, hollow resonance, a reminder that within these vaulted walls, time slowed to the rhythm of justice. The high, stained-glass windows allowed only a filtered, gray light to enter, leaving the chamber bathed in the amber glow of electric lamps that flickered ever so slightly, casting long, dancing shadows against the dark wainscoting where centuries of legal history seemed to watch from the corners. When the heavy doors at the back of the dock creaked open, the silence in the gallery deepened until it was almost deafening. John Cochrane, Mary Gemmell, and William Jordan were led in, their figures appearing small and fragile against the towering architecture of the Scottish law. John moved with a stiff, guarded gait, his eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance, his jaw set in a hard, defiant line that spoke of a conviction unyielding to the court's authority. Beside him, Mary Gemmell walked with a quiet, unsettling dignity. As the first woman in modern memory to stand in such a place on charges of conspiracy to cause explosions, she carried the weight of the moment with a stillness that was almost ghost-like. William Jordan followed, his hands resting nervously at his sides, his gaze occasionally flickering toward the jury box where 15 citizens sat in rigid rows, their faces unreadable masks of civic duty. The dock, crafted from deep-hued wood that had been burnished by the hands of countless accused men before them, felt less like a seat of judgment and more like a cage of tradition. The Lord Justice Clerk presided from the bench, his crimson robes a vivid, startling splash of color against the gray gloom of the courtroom. The prosecution began to lay out the evidence with a methodical, painstaking slowness that made the minutes stretch like shadows at sunset. One by one, the items recovered during the raids were produced and held aloft for the jury to inspect. There was a heavy glass jar, its surface smeared with faint, ghostly fingerprints, which the experts claimed had once contained the corrosive acid used to damage the symbols of the crown. Then came the detonators, small and deceptively fragile-looking, resting on a velvet cushion like grim, metallic jewelry. The prosecutor's voice was a steady, rhythmic drone, recounting the discovery of gelignite and coils of fuse hidden away in mundane domestic spaces, under floorboards and behind kitchen cupboards. He spoke of handwritten plans and maps where the targets were marked with precise, ink-drawn crosses, each one a silent testimony to a plot that had intended to shake the very foundations of the city. A detective inspector took the stand, his voice carrying the clipped, professional tone of a man who dealt in facts rather than fervor. He described the smell of the room where the materials were first found, a sharp, chemical odor that clashed violently with the domestic scent of baking bread and tea. He spoke of the way the light from his electric torch had caught the silver glint of hidden wires. Under the pressure of cross-examination, the defense sought to soften the edges of the narrative, painting the three accused not as hardened criminals, but as passionate idealists whose love for their country had let their zeal outrun their wisdom. The legal arguments were a dense thicket of precedent and interpretation, woven with the soft, rolling sounds of the Scottish bar. Every word was recorded by the court clerk, the constant, rhythmic scratching of his pen the only sound in the lapses of speech, a sound like a clock ticking away the remaining hours of the defendant's freedom. As the trial drew toward its inevitable conclusion, the atmosphere in the court became thick and heavy, almost viscous. The jury retired to consider their verdict, leaving a void of sound that was soon filled by the quiet, anxious murmurs of the spectators. In that long, agonizing wait, the accused sat perfectly still in the dock. Mary Gemmell stared down at her folded hands, her knuckles turning white against her skin as she gripped her own fingers. John Cochrane remained motionless, a statue of silent resistance. Finally, the return of the jury brought a sudden, sharp clarity to the room. The verdict of guilty was delivered with a brevity that felt at odds with the weeks of investigation and days of testimony. The Lord Justice Clerk's voice remained cool, and even as he passed his judgment. For John Cochrane, a sentence of 1 year in prison. For Mary Gemmell, 1 year. For William Jordan, 9 months. The sentences were delivered in words, but they felt like iron bars sliding into place. The trial ended not with a dramatic outburst, but with the soft rustle of robes and the heavy, final thud of the gavel. As the three were led away down the stairs to the cells below, the light outside had faded into the deep, bruised purple of a winter evening. The street lamps along the high street were beginning to glow, their light reflecting off the wet pavement in long, golden streaks that looked like tears on the face of the city. The shadows of the high court buildings stretched out across the square, long and thin, as if trying to reach the very heart of the Edinburgh they had sought to protect or perhaps to change forever. Inside the empty court, the air remained cold, holding the lingering echoes of the testimonies and the silent, invisible weight of the judgment. The small fire in the grate had long since burned down to white ash, its warmth a distant memory in the gathering dark of the Scottish night. The air inside the High Court of Glasgow in late 1976 was thick with the scent of old floor wax and the faint, lingering dampness of a Scottish winter. In this room, where the ceilings reach high toward the heavens, the sounds of the city outside were reduced to a rhythmic, distant heartbeat. The tall, arched windows held back the graying light of the afternoon, casting long, somber shadows across the rows of empty benches. There was no grand audience left, only the essential figures of the law, their robes whispering against the polished wood as they shifted in their seats. The heavy oak paneling seemed to absorb the very breath of those waiting, holding within its grains the weight of the months of testimony and the jagged edges of a terror that had once gripped the streets. You can almost feel the chill of the stone beneath your feet, a coldness that seeped through the thickest carpets, reminding everyone present that justice is a cold, deliberate thing. The silence was not empty. It was a physical presence, pressing against the eardrums like the pressure of deep water. It was the silence of a story reaching its final, inevitable period, a moment where the echoes of explosions and the frantic shouts of the past were finally being traded for the quiet, measured pace of the gavel. As the three figures stood to face their fate, the judge, Lord Kincraig, looked down from his elevated bench. His eyes were steady, reflecting the absolute finality of the law. John Cochrane, who had stood at the center of this storm, was the first to hear the words that would define the next decade and a half of his life. The judge's voice was low, carrying the gravity of the crimes committed in the name of a cause that had fractured into violence. For the conspiracy, for the possession of the materials that had shattered the peace of the city, John Cochrane was sentenced to 15 years of imprisonment. 15 years. The words seemed to hang in the air, vibrating against the stone walls. It is a long time for a man to sit in silence, away from the wind and the rain of the open world. You can imagine the sound of those 15 years settling into his shoulders, a weight that would not be lifted until the world outside had changed beyond recognition. The courtroom did not erupt in protest. Instead, it seemed to settle deeper into the earth, as if the very foundations of the building were acknowledging the removal of a man who had sought to shake them. Then came the turn of William Jordan and Mary Gemmell. They stood close, the space between them filled with the shared memory of their actions. William Jordan, for his role in the plotting and the execution of the campaign, heard the number 14 fall from the judge's lips. 14 years. A lifetime of seasons passing behind bars, a long journey through the gray corridors of the Scottish prison system. And for Mary Gemmell, the sentence was 9 years. 9 years to reflect on the choices made in the heat of a political fever. The sentencing was a quiet tallying of costs. It was the conclusion of the army of the provisional government's brief and jagged history. As each sentence was read, the court reporter's pens scratched across the paper, the only sound in the vast room. That tiny, rhythmic clicking of the pen was the sound of history being fixed in place. The trio did not look at one another. They looked forward, perhaps seeing the long, narrow path that now lay before them, a path paved with stone and iron, far from the clandestine meetings and the smell of cordite. The justice meted out that day was a somber closure, a signal to the city that the period of uncertainty was over, and the era of the bomb was being replaced by the era of the cell. When the gavel finally struck the block, it did not make a loud crack. It was a dull, heavy thud that signaled the end. The police officers moved with a practiced, gentle efficiency, placing hands on elbows to guide the 3 prisoners toward the narrow staircase that led down, away from the light of the courtroom and into the belly of the building. You can hear the rhythmic clink of the heavy iron keys against the belts of the guards, a metallic music that marks the transition from freedom to the state's care. Their boots sounded on the stone stairs, a hollow, echoing descent. Step by step, the sounds of the upper world faded. The muffled traffic, the distant voices of people walking on the salt market, the wind whistling through the cracks in the masonry, all of it vanished, replaced by the cool, damp air of the holding cells. In those lower reaches, the walls are thick and unforgiving, built to hold the secrets and the sorrows of centuries. The echoes of their footsteps seemed to linger in the stairwell long after the heavy steel door had groaned shut. It was a finality that resonated through the very bedrock of Glasgow, a sense that a chapter of violence had been sealed away, deep beneath the surface of the bustling city. The ripples of this trial did not stop at the prison gates. Across the United Kingdom, the 1970s had been a decade of shifting shadows and tightening laws. The actions of John Cochrane, Mary Gemmell, and William Jordan had contributed to a growing determination within the British government to fortify the legal walls. Security laws were refined, and the vigilance of the state grew sharper, more focused. The memory of the Tartan Army and its offshoots would slowly fade from the front pages, replaced by new headlines and different struggles, but the impact remained in the quiet, unseen changes to how the country protected itself. The buildings that had been targeted were repaired, the stones scrubbed clean of the soot and the scars of the blasts. Today, if you walk past the old stock exchange or the pylons that stand like giants across the moorland, there is no sign of the fire that once burned there. The stone remembers, perhaps, in the way it holds the cold, but the world has moved on. The names of the conspirators are now footnotes in a larger history, quiet echoes in the vast, winding story of a nation finding its way through the dark. The terror has dissolved into the mist of the Highlands and the fog of the Clyde, leaving behind only the peace that comes when the storm has finally spent its strength. And so the lights in the High Court are extinguished, one by one. The shadows reclaim the benches, the witness stand, and the judge's high seat. The city outside settles into its evening rhythm, the street lamps flickering to life in the purple twilight. The weight of the past has been acknowledged, and the sentences are being served in the deep, rhythmic silence of the night. There is nothing left to fear from these ghosts. The fire is out, the iron is locked, and the echoes have finally found their rest in the stone. You are here in the stillness of your own space, far removed from the cold corridors and the heavy gavels. The story is finished, and the night is yours to claim. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.